All right, we're going to broadcast live now.
Okay. Good evening. Welcome to the Costa Mesa Planning Commission meeting for Monday, June 22nd. Call the meeting to order and ask that you join the commissioners and I in the pledge to our nation's flag. Please stand. And ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Brenda. Julie, roll call, please.
Chair Jericho,
Here.
Vice Chair Harlan,
Here.
Commissioner Colbert,
Present.
Commissioner Perkins,
Here.
Commissioner Russell,
Here.
Commissioner Torje,
Here.
Commissioner Zick.
Here.
Thank you, Julie. Announcements tonight: in order to minimize the spread of the COVID-19 virus, Governor Newsom has issued executive orders that temporarily suspend requirements of the Brown Act, which allows Planning Commission members to attend Planning Commission meetings telephonically. Given the health risks associated with COVID-19, City Council chambers are closed to the public until further notice. If you would like to participate in tonight's meeting, you can participate via the following options. We are strongly encouraged to observe the Planning Commission meeting live on Costa Mesa TV. That's Spectrum Channel 3 and AT&T Uverse Channel 99, or online at youtube.com/Costa Mesa TV. You can also participate in this webinar by visiting the link listed on tonight's agenda, or you can sign in to Zoom with webinar ID 953-6143-5393, password 677948. If you wish to participate by telephone, you can dial 1-669-900-6833. And then if you wish to speak during public comment or one of the public hearing items, when called upon to speak, you press *9. With that, that takes us to public comments. Public comment is for all items not listed on tonight's agenda. If there are members of the public who wish to speak tonight during public comment, again, that's on items not listed on the agenda. If you are participating via Zoom, please click the raise your hand button. If not, Julie, I believe we have one electronic communication that we've placed into the record.
That is correct. We received one public comment from Marianne Chappell that was forwarded to the commission and was made a part of the record.
Okay, thank you very much. Any of the attendees on the Zoom webinar wish to speak during public comment? Okay, seeing none, I will close public comment. And that brings us to Planning Commissioner comments, and we'll start this evening with Commissioner Russell.
Here we go. Yeah, I guess over the last few weeks, I've been a little overwhelmed by A, what I don't know, and B, what I don't know, And this kind of goes to the edge of what we're going to be talking about later, but one of the things I've been looking at is how do we become more inclusive? And by extending, how do we get better outreach? That's part of our job. And to look at including people that maybe don't feel comfortable for whatever reason coming and speaking. And to some extent, we often think about it in terms of inviting others to the table. And I happened to get an email today from Strong Towns. And it was addressing some of these things. One, that public outreach is sometimes we're asking the wrong questions. And sometimes the way that we're presenting it is not inviting. One of the quotes that addressed this was something that Bernice King tweeted out, which is, even the statement, let's invite more Black people to the table, implies ownership of the table. And I want to make sure that for myself that I'm recognizing that I'm a servant to the people and the residents of Costa Mesa, and that we need to do a better job, perhaps, of asking different questions so that people feel included. We have a tendency to get asked the same questions, get the same input from many times the same people, and we get the answers that we want. And so one of the things that they were talking about is 4 points, and that is to humbly observe where people struggle, as opposed to identify the next smallest thing we can do to address that struggle, to do that thing right away, and to repeat, so that we can keep looking at what are the true needs of the residents of Costa Mesa, and how do we address that from a planning perspective. So I just wanted to share some of that with the public and with the other commissioners. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Russell. Commissioner Colbert.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a couple of comments. First off, thank you for those words, Commissioner Russell. It's good to see that a lot of this information, that we have to do a lot of unlearning in our own, to understand what biases we all possess, be it class, be it race, be it any other thing that attempts to divide us. But often we find out that we have more similarities than differences. And I think that's what we're learning in the past few weeks, that there are a lot more things that bring us together than divide us. And so I think as we be patient, and I ask people to be patient, continuously asking my friends and colleagues on Facebook, to give grace and space to people as we continue to unlearn a lot of things which have just been taught to us, and give us the opportunity to grow together. And I think if we continue to provide grace and space to people, then we'll get further. And as the unlearning continues to take place this weekend, which kind of leads into my comments, this past weekend, we celebrated Juneteenth. And we know that Juneteenth, we're seeing a lot of corporations, and it was really national for the first time. And as a native Texan, I grew up celebrating Juneteenth. It was the biggest holiday in my city. And it was something that I looked forward to every year. We had horses, it was a big parade, it was a car show, families came out, we had cards and games and softballs and sports, and it was one of the biggest events. And it wasn't until I moved outside of Texas that I realized that not a lot of people celebrate Juneteenth. And I would often find myself in any community just telling people about the importance of this date and why we should recognize it, and learned that a lot of people just did not know what Juneteenth was and what it symbolized for communities, specifically in Texas, but for the nation in particular. And so I just wanted to tell people who may not know what Juneteenth is, just a bit of background. It was when Gordon Granger, who was letting people know that basically it was the freeing or the liberation of the last enslaved people in America, albeit there were some states that still had some resistance strategies in place and didn't really move forward until the complete abolishment of the 13th Amendment in 1865 on June 19th in Galveston, Texas. That's when, after 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, that's when those slaves were freed. And so as a part of my lineage and heritage, being a native Texan, those are some of my family members. And so I take pride in celebrating that. But I was so excited to see so many people commemorating that date as it is a part of history, as it meant independence for Black people in this country. And so I'm thankful that we're all learning together. I'm asking people to give people space, grace, and as we take time to unlearn these things. Last, in closing, I would like to just acknowledge the death and passing of one of my debate coaches, Dr. Thomas F. Freeman. He passed 2 weeks ago. His service was last week, and he passed at 100 years of age. He was one of the most noted scholars and debate teachers, I would say, in the country. He taught from the likes of Barbara Jordan to Dr. Martin Luther King at Morehouse College. He was my professor for 4 years and made a very, very positive impact on my life. He was the first person that actually took me abroad to get involved in Lincoln Douglas debate and compete in London, England. And he did that for a lot of students who didn't have the capacity or access at the university level to travel abroad and do that. He lived a full life, and it was when the university closed that he succumbed to just natural causes. And we're often attributing to, he loved teaching so much and had taught at the institution for 70 plus years that when he could teach no more, then he felt his job was done. So I just wanted to recognize his life and legacy, Dr. Thomas F. Freeman, this evening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Colbert. Commissioner Tourget.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to start by thanking my fellow commissioners for their thoughtful comments last week and this week. I think I learned a lot, and I'm just always humbled to be on this commission. I've had some conversations with members of the public in the last couple of weeks as well, and I just always say I'm honored to live in Costa Mesa, and I love living with and serving alongside you all. I'll be brief tonight. I will be attending over the next couple of weeks a couple Zoom meetings and webinars about public space and how we respond to anti-Black racism and urban practices and what it means in the time of COVID. There's a great one tomorrow. Commissioner Colbert sent out a document earlier that talked about some great folks to follow in the planning field, and a couple of them will be on this panel tomorrow. And so I would just recommend checking out resources with the American Planning Association or other resources as well to just continue education. I know I have a lot to learn, and I'm looking forward to learning more. So that's all for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Tourget. Commissioner Zick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll tell you what, it seems every time we get together, I just continue, I shouldn't be a surprise, but I just continue to be impressed with the depth of this commission that we've got, and the complete diversity of thought and ideas. I think Commissioner Russell, she used one of my favorite little phrases. A lot of people do. You don't know what you don't know. And you start to hear somebody talk about something, or they talk about a perspective on a subject you may think you know about, but then their perspective reveals that, wow, there's a lot more to this subject than maybe you had originally thought. I also found, and I hadn't heard this before, Commissioner Russell, and I thought this was excellent, the implication of the phrase, inviting people to the table. The implication being that you own the table. And Commissioner Colbert, you said something that is almost a similar idea to me, where we talk about giving people space. And it almost seems to imply that they're the ones that need the space, not us. We got our act together. We know what's going on. We got our position. We have the right answer. We just need to give people space to, to evolve their own thoughts about something. And I think there's an implication there too when we talk about that. We use a lot of language, just phrases, shorthand, colloquialisms that we just kind of grow up with, we hear from people use in the movies, and almost without thinking, we use these phrases in our language without the intention of conveying the meaning that something like invite to the table might convey to somebody. And we wouldn't mean it when we said that. And so I think it just will probably behoove us to try to be more sensitive to the language we use, that we've used for a long time, most of us, some of us not as long as others. The other idea of unlearning things. I think there's probably an equal amount of unlearning needed as new learning. If anyone thinks they don't need to be learning anymore, they're probably not a member of this commission. I think everybody here understands learning is a lifetime endeavor. One thing that I have felt over the last couple of weeks, somewhat similar to the way Commissioner Russell has had some feelings over the last couple of weeks. I've had an uncomfortable feeling about being wrong or being perceived as wrong, that somehow I've done something wrong simply by my birthright or by my upbringing or by opportunities that I've had or luck that has crossed my path in life. And I think there's a lot of this that I'm perceiving that's coming across in the news where, and maybe it's a societal problem that we're seeing more now than we have maybe in past decades. There's an idea of victimhood and blame. Something bad happens and we're, immediately feel victimized and we immediately look for somebody to blame. If there's a bad storm and our house blows over, our first inclination is to blame the weatherman because they didn't tell us about this storm that's coming. Or if they did, and the house still blew over, then our next inclination is to blame the builder of our house. I mean, certainly the builder must have done something wrong. But if that's not possible, well, maybe we blame the city because the builder did everything according to the code. So it must be the city that's to blame because the codes are inadequate. So I think my point is that there are circumstances where we're looking to find the root cause and we substitute blame for that. And when there's something that isn't going right, instead of looking at that as simply a problem or a situation to be addressed, we tend to look at it more as victimization. And so I think that's unfortunate. Had a couple other comments, and I'll switch from serious to very light. I was fortunate today to have the opportunity to play golf at the Costa Mesa Country Club. This is the first time I've been out there since the pandemic. And I realized that in most places of work, and the country club is no, it's a public course, the country club is no different. Their employees and staff are working under much more difficult circumstances and constraints because of the pandemic. I was exceptionally impressed with their friendliness, their professionalism, their helpfulness. There was signage around the course relative to masks. There were precautions that they had made around the course in order for it to be a more safe and enjoyable experience. It was an awesome day out there. And kudos to the entire Costa Mesa Country Club team. Just a superb job out there. But then the other end of the spectrum, and I didn't want to let this pass. you know, the recent flashpoints of violence that we've seen in the news have really gotten our collective attention. And it's drawn people from many different corners into a national conversation. I don't think there's anybody out there that doesn't have an opinion or a thought about what's going on that hasn't been very visceral. Many people have been expressive about this. Most, I think, in terms of numbers, have done it in a way that our society accepts and celebrates, and that's peaceful protesting. Fortunately, this hasn't been everyone, which is counterproductive. And it takes away from the messages and the grievances and the ideas for change that people have. It's a very unfortunate thing. And what precipitated from what was unquestionably a cruel and inhumane action by a Minneapolis police officer has, again, unfortunately been used by some as a broad brush to paint all police officers. And of course, we know this is wrong. It perpetuates stereotypes, which is precisely what conversations about diversity are all about. It's breaking down stereotypes. And from these flashpoints, we've seen the migration of issues from the police use of force to subjects of statues, monuments, names of streets, parks, etc. And I'm not here to defend anybody for whom the honor of naming has been given. But here's the thing. Removing evidence of their existence doesn't change history or their role in it. And to pass judgment on people of history who at the time were well thought of is a revisionist activity that may make us feel good or vindictive, but it does little to move the ball forward. It buries the ball. And what we need to be doing is carrying the ball and talking about the ball. So lastly, I want to talk about staff for a second. Again, I want to commend staff for their professionalism, their hard work during this pandemic. And I appreciate the strain it's putting on them. They're not showing it, but I know it's there. Frankly, the strain is on everyone. And based on the council's recent actions relative to the budget, I'd like to thank staff in advance for what will undoubtedly be even more difficult and challenging times ahead. And I think if we all work together and all support each other, we'll still get a lot of good work done. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I normally don't speak this long, but I felt it important tonight.
Thank you, Commissioner Zick. Commissioner Perkins.
Great. Thank you, Chair. So we'll be talking about racial equity and Black Lives Matter a little bit later in the meeting. So I wanted to focus my comments tonight on public participation in our meetings and their relationship here to COVID-19. With regard to COVID infection rates, 12 states have hit record highs for single day number of new cases in COVID-19 in the last week. California is one of those states. And here in Orange County, in all the time before this weekend, we never had a day with more than 200 new diagnosed cases. Both days this weekend, as many of us know, we reported more than 400 new cases without, it doesn't look like, a corresponding increase in testing. We've had 269 people die in this county alone, and 120,000 people died in our nation. And to bring this to a personal level, Michelle, my partner of 25 years now, her mom lives in a residential memory care facility here in town. We used to go out to dinner with Michelle's mom every week, and she loved it, but we haven't been able to even visit her for more than 3 months. On Friday, we finally were able to visit. The facility just started opening up visits. They did a fantastic job. Visits were outside. Staff were present to ensure no physical contact occurred, and social distancing was maintained, and masks were required. Time was limited. Even though it was hard not to hug or touch or even, you know, share pictures on a phone like we did, it was a beautiful afternoon to get to see her mom. But on Saturday, we learned that a resident in that memory care facility had contracted coronavirus. Visits now have stopped, and the facility, I know, is doing everything they can to stop the spread. But I really feel for the residents, and I fear for Michelle's mom. And I just wanted to say that we're all in an interconnected web. And what one of us does affects many of us. So really want to encourage, please, let's all try to be careful. Let's thoughtfully reevaluate things like our economic reopening so that the most vulnerable among us can safely get through this pandemic. As it applies to this commission, I hope we're able to maintain remote meetings, and we were talking about that a little bit before this, for as long as the virus is present. And even when we do return to in-person meetings, I hope we can maintain this Zoom element of the meeting so that people can participate from home without having to attend in person, both for health, but also just because it allows them to participate in a much more equitable manner. You don't have to come in person and wait and for 3 hours to make a 2-minute comment. One question I also actually had for staff, I noticed on our agenda that it doesn't say that we're accepting email comments live during the meeting anymore. And it looks like instead it seemed like it was the sort of pre-COVID policy of entering emails into the record that were emailed before the commission by noon on the day of the meeting. And I wanted to check and find out more on that, because while I do agree there's no need to read all the emails live that were received well before the meeting that all of us got, just announce them. I do feel that accepting email comments live during the meeting and reading those comments into the record can provide an important alternate method for public comments to be heard. I know, especially with many of my students, participation in public speaking is very stressful for many people. And this format in particular, where it's recorded, where it's live streamed on YouTube, and where anybody can watch it, can be very stressful for people to make comments in. So I just wanted to see what are our policies and maybe see if we could continue accepting email comments live during the meeting for those who are maybe less able to speak or less willing to speak. That's all I had. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Perkins. I'll probably ask the city attorney to address those your question during a city attorney report at the end of the meeting tonight. Vice Chair Harlan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be very brief. I know my colleagues have given a great deal of thought to the issue of equity, and I appreciate what they've shared so far. I appreciate that Commissioner Perkins has brought this issue up in particular tonight. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion about what kind of action we may take to deal with this. And I will leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm to try to be brief. So my wife and I and my family, we have raised our kids here. We've been residents of Costa Mesa for 27 years. And I wanted to touch on a few points in Costa Mesa's history tonight on why I think we, among many, if not all, Orange County cities, have a pretty good record of diversity and inclusivity in city government and in business. As long as I've been a part of the town and the nearly 14 years that I've been on commissions. In 2001, the city council appointed as its mayor the city's first LGBT mayor in Libby Cowan, who was a terrific representative. 2 years later, in 2003, the city council appointed Judge Karen Robinson as mayor, the first African-American mayor of Costa Mesa. Just obviously the most recent example is Manny Chavez being elected to the city council as the first Latino to be elected to the city council. Took too long, but we've made that achievement. Council also voted, I believe at the end of last year, or the first part of this year, to fly the pride flag over City Hall. And in my dealings with business people in the city through the chamber, through various other organizations, I can assure most of my colleagues, all of my colleagues, I hope, and the city council knows, we have probably one of the most diverse bases of business ownership anywhere in Orange County. So apart from our discussion tonight, which I'm looking forward to, and there's always room to be better, I am exceptionally proud of Costa Mesa for the level of diversity and progressiveness that we've shown in our city government and in our business community for the 27 years that I've been here. You know, for everything that's that we've accomplished so far. So I just wanted to say that, and then we'll leave it at that and move on to the consent calendar. We have none tonight. So that will take us to public hearing item number 1. Julie, please.
Public hearing item number 1, a resolution recommending that the City Council give first reading to an ordinance amending Title 13 of the Costa Mesa Municipal Zoning Code to clean up internal inconsistencies between various chapters of the zoning code and to conform to recent revisions to and requirements of state law, Code Amendment CO-20-02. Staff requests that the Planning Commission continue this item to the next regular Planning Commission meeting of July 13th, 2020.
Thank you, Julie. I will open the public hearing and move that we continue this item to the meeting of July 13th. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, motion by the chair to continue to 13th, seconded by Commissioner Zick. Julie, please call the roll.
Chair Jericho,
Aye.
Vice Chair Harlan,
Aye.
Commissioner Colbert,
Aye.
Commissioner Perkins,
Aye.
Commissioner Russell,
Aye.
Commissioner Torje,
Aye.
Commissioner Zick.
Aye.
That motion carried 7-0.
Thank you, commissioners. Next item, Julie, new business item number 1.
New business item number 1, Planning Commission discussion of systematic inequality and the formation of a subcommittee to address this topic. Please note that we have received 3 written comments that have been forwarded to the commission and included as a part of the record.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Lee, a brief report, please.
Thank you, Chair and members of the Planning Commission. The item before you this evening is a discussion by the Planning Commission regarding systemic inequality and the potential formation of a subcommittee to address this topic. In the way of background, at the Planning Commission meeting of June 8th, 2020, during Commissioner comments and suggestions, Commissioner Perkins proposed that the Commission agendize this topic for discussion. After discussion, the Planning Commission requested that staff agendize this matter for the next Commission meeting, and as such, the item has been placed on the agenda for tonight. Commissioner Perkins submitted a memo request on this topic to the Planning Commission dated June 19th, 2020, which has been provided to the Planning Commission. In addition, Commissioner Colbert has submitted additional information, which staff has also shared with the Commission. Staff does not have a specific recommendation on this item. Pursuant to Council Policy number 300-6, which requires City Council approval of requests to staff that will require more than 4 hours of staff time, if the Commission wishes to create a subcommittee or otherwise provide direction to staff to work on this matter, staff recommends that the Commission make that request to the City Council for authorization. That concludes staff's presentation this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Commissioner Perkins, this was your request, so the floor is yours, sir.
Great. Thank you very much. And I do have a couple of slides prepared. So if we could share those. I do greatly appreciate the Commission willing to talk about this item and agendizing it after our discussion the last time. I think this is such an important topic that has been brought to light. So I wanted to just share a couple things, give a little bit of background on the memo that I shared and what my thoughts are, and then hopefully have us have a discussion on this and hopefully hear from any members of the public who have experiences on this. I include on this cover slide my professional affiliation as a professor of biology at OCC to partially to show a couple of things. And number one is that I am not an expert in this topic. And so I apologize if there are any inaccuracies in the memo or if I misstate things. I am trying my best to learn and, as we talked about earlier, unlearn things that I thought I knew on this before. So I just wanted to mention that. And also that I'm sort of coming at this from a sort of scientific perspective where I am thinking of what questions should we ask as a group, as a city, as we look at this. I don't necessarily have the answers, or even know necessarily what all the questions should be. So I'm looking forward to our discussion. If we could have the next slide. I'm not seeing the next slide.
Sorry, commissioners, if you'll give me a moment, it appears to be freezing up here. Oh,
We can actually go to the general plan slide. The background we already talked about, so we can go to the next one. One thing I just wanted to mention, right, we as a commission are focused on, and as a city, we're focused on implementing our general plan. So our general plan does have multiple statements on it that apply to equity. In our introduction, we have that. In our housing element, we have a statement on equity in housing, not using the word equity, but getting the idea across. And then in our sort of economic development section as well. So our general plan does look at this. And if we can hit the next slide. When we're thinking about equity versus equality, one of the things that I think sometimes can be confusing, and I know this has been in a lot of discussions lately, but I think it bears repeating that when we're talking about equity versus equality, the words are very similar, but are not equal. When we are looking at equality, we are looking at essentially sort of treating everyone the same, state of being equal. But equity is looking at justice and fairness for all, that sometimes treating people equally or having equal conditions for groups or individuals is not necessarily fair given the historic or current inequalities on there. As you can see on the image in the upper right, there's many images that have been going around as memes. This one, I think from a bicycling perspective, not me as an active transportation person, I think sort of gets that point across that equal treatment is not always equitable treatment, especially when you have historic inequalities to take into account. So that brings us to what are some of those historical practices. So we can see on the next slide, the memo that I introduced has a number of references in it and are taking a look at what are some examples of, say, for housing practices that have been done historically and maybe being done even today that are exclusionary, that are inequitable on that. The start of zoning in the United States was racially tinged. Racially explicit zoning codes were passed as far back as 1910 on that, where you had areas of the city zoned literally for colored people or white people, to use the language of the day. This was banned by the US Supreme Court in 1917, although cities continued trying to do this for decades afterwards. You also had at a more private level, racially restricted deeds or covenants, where when the deed was recorded or a property sale was recorded, a restriction was added to it that individuals of certain races or other groups were not able to purchase the property. Oftentimes violations of that would either be a lawsuit of that or potentially losing the deed of the property to the prior owner. The Federal Housing Administration and lender policies denied mortgages based on race and ethnicity, also funded public housing projects potentially based on them. Realtor seller landlord discrimination, right? A number of different forms that exclusionary housing can take place. And so one of the things that I wanted to take a look at to help inform this discussion is what has happened in our area. So we can see the next slide on this, that when we're looking at equity in housing, we want to be looking at both, are any of those types of inequitable practices currently ongoing, but also what has historically happened to provide context to help us understand how we got where we are today as a city. Again, and I want to be very clear as we move into this discussion, that inequities in the past, if they occur, are a window into what has helped shape our history. They are not necessarily a sign that we are doing these very things today, but they help open our eyes to how we got to where we are today. in this vein, I have been working with another individual and trying to research exclusionary housing practices historically in this area. And one of the areas where you can find potentially black or white exclusionary housing practices are racially restricted deeds. Those became very common in the 1920s and 30s as a way to supposedly help protect property values. They even were almost boilerplate. We found about a dozen properties that were built pre-1948 when a Supreme Court decision meant that exclusionary deeds were not enforceable. And these dozen properties were scattered around Newport Beach and Costa Mesa, biased more to Newport Beach because of new development. And we found that roughly half of those had exclusionary deeds. If we go to the next slide, this is one from Costa Mesa on the east side. So you can see the text of that today. Chris Jepson over at the Orange County Archives has done a fantastic amount of work to help find these documents and actually look and see what was actually going on historically. This is a deed that was recorded in 1925. It's from the 200 block of Flower Street. And based on what Chris Jepson has said, all lots in tract 594, which have the rough boundaries of, this same boilerplate language was included in. And so, in case you're reading, it says that the land or any portion thereof shall not be leased or rented to a person other than of the Caucasian race, nor shall any person or persons other than of the Caucasian race be permitted to occupy said land, it being understood that the term other than persons of the Caucasian race includes Japanese and Mexicans. So it happened here in our town. How widespread it is, I do not know. If we go on to the next slide, this also racially restricted deeds were also present in Newport Beach. We pulled some deeds from Balboa Peninsula, Cliff Haven, Lido Isle, and Newport Heights. The first three of those, Chris Jepson reported that entire tracts also had these racially restricted deeds as just in every single property in that tract. And you can see one sample of it. That's one from Lido Isle there. So we have that as part of our history. These racially restricted deeds did become explicitly illegal and unenforceable in 1968 with the Fair Housing Act. And they're an example of how exclusionary practices sort of evolve over time. If we go to the next slide, this is a quote from an article that is looking at the sort of change in exclusionary practices. And again, not saying that any of these are necessarily happening right now. This is what we want to look at. But this one is saying in 1917, after the US Supreme Court struck down policies that explicitly zoned separate residential areas for Black and whites, many local governments shifted to a new form of exclusionary zoning, policies that made it illegal to build anything other than single-family homes. These policies delivered many of the same results by different means. They kept out most Black people and virtually all low-income people on this. And so to go to the next slide, when we look at deeds from, say, 1959 in Mesa Verde, a house in Mesa Verde, we see some of these potentially exclusionary processes occurring where you are limiting it to single family homes, what we would consider R1 today. You have a minimum lot size, minimum house size, no accessory or secondary structures, no animal rearing, no business establishments. In this contrast, especially, I was looking in newspapers from the 1940s in Costa Mesa and before, and in a lot of those newspapers, a lot of houses were essentially almost unrestricted residential is one way you could describe it, where you could put multiple buildings on a lot. You could have chickens. A lot of that housing ads, if they said anything in the ad, it was actually that you have chicken accommodating structures and whatnot. This was potentially exclusionary. As a point in reference, the average new house size in 1959 was less than 1,300 square feet. So we're mandating a better than average house or larger than average house here. So this is going to exclude people at the very least by income potential, which also has other equity metrics tightly correlated to it. To continue on to the next slide, exclusionary housing practices do not always necessarily limit themselves to deed restrictions or zoning. This is an anecdote I heard and have documented that was talking about tracts in Newport Beach requiring a letter of reference to be able to be shown the property. And this was, as this person says, well understood to be a tactic to prevent Blacks and Jews from buying into the neighborhood. So that's some of the sort of, again, history on housing from a business development perspective. We can see the next slide, where on the business development side, we also wonder about the same thing. You know, a lot of that has been talking about housing, but one of the things when we look at business environments, and this is more talking about nationwide, development environments are generally more open to high wealth investors and access to capital, because things are expensive, like conditional use permits, is unequal. You have almost double the number of Black-owned firms than white-owned firms having things like financing applications rejected. And as we talked about earlier, equal is not necessarily equitable. One of the things that my eyes have opened up to a little bit recently is things like our flat fees for permits. We charge the very same dollar amount to a person just trying, a local resident who's just trying to scrape together enough cash to open up a little store versus some big multinational corporation. And the affordability of these fees to those two groups is very different. Which is motivating things like greenlining, which is providing a proactive practice spreading economic opportunities to communities of color. So I just wanted to share sort of those thoughts. My next slide, I have some questions that I think this raises. And again, I'm really viewing this as what are the questions maybe we can ask and how do we move forward to evaluate, are any of these practices still occurring? What has occurred? Let's understand the history so we know where we came from. But are any of these practices still occurring? And then how do we move forward to potentially try to create policy or other changes that would remedy inequities that we potentially uncovered? As two possible ways to look at it in the memo, I have suggested a couple of options, which are on the next slide. Which was to, our bylaws of the Planning Commission do not currently allow ad hoc committees to be formed, so potentially amending that, and then potentially trying to create an ad hoc planning committee on equity, tasked with studying, conducting outreach on, and creating a report with recommendations to the City Council on previously mentioned questions. More details are in the memo, and then potentially staff time, as Ms. Lee suggested would probably be needed. As a final thought, again, days are like months right now. I've been thinking about this since that memo was sent. On the last slide, which is the next one, another way to have to think about this potentially is if budget is a big concern, right? That potential committee that I outlined in the memo could potentially require quite a large amount of work. So a potential approach could be to maybe just create a group of us to research or propose guiding principles and metrics to be used in an equity review of our housing and economic development policies. So create a team of us to try to figure out what would some guiding principles be, what would some metrics or analyses that could be used to evaluate these policies in an equity framework be, and then that group thinking about what are the next steps in this, right? We have the housing element. Should this just be folded into that potentially, or should it be its own project? I don't know enough at this point to really say. So maybe this group could do that. So that's what I had. I just wanted to share that. I'm really interested to hear what you guys think. I personally view myself as one of the least qualified to study this topic. And so I really want to hear what you guys think and also what members of the public are thinking. So thank you for the time for this tonight.
Commissioner Perkins, thank you very much. Also, thank you for the effort and the time that you've put in to assemble your thoughts and some ideas and for your research. Commissioners, let's go over to, are there any commissioners who have questions for either staff or Commissioner Perkins? Raise your hand, please, on the panelist code. Okay, I don't see any wait, Commissioner Zick has raised his hand, so you're first up, sir.
Well, I do have questions and I wanted to note that, but I would like to hear from the public and reserve my questioning of staff until that time. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, so I will open this for public comment. Ms. Green, it looks like we have a caller on, call-in user 1.
Hello.
Hello, you may speak now.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you for your report that you just did. And it brought to mind that, in fact, have we had any complaints regarding the sales of homes in equity through like any state agency or the city agency? And I'd also like to remind the council that, you know, our city is, 64% rental. We're 94% built out. We have budgeting issues that are going to restrict our resources and whatnot. And some of these certainly don't fit within the parameter of our budgetary demands as we go right now. But equity and equality, absolutely. The ad hoc committee, I want to comment on that because I believe it's not accepted, because an ad hoc committee, especially for planning, it doesn't allow the community to participate or even be at your meetings. And I think some of the issues that you're discussing right now could have a very important change in property, how we view property. Are we going to return to the Amish and have cows on our back lawns? Some of those things along that line. So you have a very important job, a huge job, but I hope you keep within the parameters of our city and the goals of our city and how our city has, since 1953, how they've set up and managed. But I would like to know about any complaints that have been made by anybody of color or Hispanic or Anglo that have violated housing orders, or that anything that's processing now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. Ms. Green, anyone else on the line wish to speak on this?
No, we have no others.
Okay, and either Ms. Colgan or Ms. Green, did we receive any email communications that we've put into the record?
Yes. We, as I stated earlier, we did receive 3 written comments.
Julie, I'm sorry, I heard
Okay.
that. Thank you very much. My short-term memory is fading by the day. Okay, so I'll close public comment and bring it back to the commissioners. And I know Commissioner Zick, you had some questions.
I do have a couple. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just going to start with an observation. It doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of people tuned into this meeting. Now, they very well could be watching on the city's website. They could very well be planning on watching playback of this meeting at some future time. But this particular agenda item and the subject matter in it, I think potentially is one of the most important things that we could be talking about that could potentially lead to change that could affect a lot of people. And to not have the public engaged in greater numbers than we currently have, I think is unfortunate. I think we need to invite more of these people to the table. Oh no, okay, sorry. If you heard my earlier comments, you'll know I'm teasing there. Okay, so my first question is for Commissioner Perkins, and I'd like to say that again, I'm impressed with the thoughtfulness that you have brought to this. Clearly, from your presentation, this is a topic you have given a lot of thought to. You have a lot of concern and interest in. I think when you say you're not an expert in this subject, I suppose to some extent you're being humble, maybe selling yourself a little bit short. So I think from that standpoint, I want to thank you for bringing this forward. I think the discussion is good regardless of where we end tonight. I have a question for you, and that is, and it's not particularly relevant, but it just kind of goes, I think, to the level of engagement that you brought to this. This memo that you attached and your presentation are, I don't know if I'd say exhaustive, but there's a tremendous amount of material in here. Is this work product yours exclusively, or are you working with any outside organizations on this topic?
Thank you. This is mine exclusively. I've had a few other people come in and help provide some suggestions, bouncing ideas off of folks, but this is me. So.
Okay, all right, thank you. So I've got a couple of questions for staff. And I guess I'm gonna start with this one. And Mr. Curtis and Ms. Lee, please bear with me when I'm asking these questions, because I've said on numerous occasions, and I've said at the outset of this meeting, how impressed and grateful I am for the professionalism and work products of your entire team. You two obviously are great experts and leaders, and I think the work of your team is reflective of that. So if I ask you a question that may sound a little bit edgy, it is only because I'm really trying to understand where your mind is on some of these topics, because I don't think this subject matter can be taken with anything less than the full seriousness that we should have. And so my first question is, I'm surprised that there is no staff recommendation regarding this item. And when I say that, you've heard me articulate or pontificate, depending on how you might characterize it, on previous agenda items where I rely on your recommendation, and I appreciate your recommendations. Most often it's to approve, but it's based on your professional judgment, and you're trying to lead us to what you believe to be the right decision, whether or not the commission goes that direction or not. You're taking a position on something. I'm just surprised that on this item, you have no recommendation, and I doubt that that means you have no opinion. So I'm asking you about your opinion and your recommendation at a top level. I've got additional questions, but at a top level, how does something of this sensitivity not come with a recommendation?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Zick, the reason that staff chose not to make a recommendation was because this item was brought to you by a commissioner at the request of the commission, ostensibly to make a policy recommendation for action to the city council. We did not want to presuppose what that policy direction from the commission might be, so we put it out to you on its face value. Since I've been with the city, and I'm certainly since you've been on the planning commission, I think this is the first time we've ever had an item like this come straight from a commissioner to the commission, and we didn't feel it appropriate for us to essentially try to presuppose what the commission's policy recommendations might be.
Okay, I think that's a fair answer. So one of the things that I found interesting and enlightening, and I've heard some of this material from, well, I think from the planning officials forum that was up at the Nixon Library a couple of years ago that I was fortunate enough to attend. So some of the ideas of the active discrimination that took place in our history, I'm familiar with. And I appreciated that Commissioner Perkins cited some additional examples that were very close to home in Costa Mesa and Newport Beach. Admittedly, they were in 1925 and 1928. Those weren't, I'm sure, the only examples, but of those two, nearly 100 years ago. And so I wouldn't think they're necessarily representative of where we are today, but they do provide, as Commissioner Perkins said, a window into the past and what had occurred. So that leads to my next question, Mr. Curtis. Are you aware of the existence of any language or any provisions or any evidence in the city's documentation that there exists systemic inequality or institutional racism?
That's a loaded question.
You bet it is loaded.
Commissioner Zick, no, I'm not aware of any. There are certainly items, depending on your outlook and your approach to this, that Commissioner Perkins referenced, like single family zoning, obviously can be more aimed towards people with income to afford single family housing as opposed to rentals. As the caller indicated, we have well over half of the units in our city are multifamily housing. I know that the number of renters is higher than that, but some of those renters are renting single family housing as well. So no, I'm not aware of any systemic issues as such in our code, least overtly so. Without looking at this through the lens of others, I can't necessarily say that someone else might not see something that I don't see that way, as being at least somewhat discriminatory, but I do not believe there are.
Prior to the pandemic, were you aware of any claims from any individual or any organization of this nature against the city? Again, of systematic inequality or institutional racism?
No.
Okay. Are you familiar with, and I'm looking at the memo, the first page, and it indicates that some of the national and local protests have led to calls for local governments to study and find solutions for inequity. Of course, the premise there is that there exists such inequity in our local policies. Other than this agenda item, have you received any inquiry or any call on the city to initiate this type of study?
No, we have not.
Still on that page, there is a comment that's talking about this exclusionary housing practice, and that a cursory review of literature reveals that there is current racial animus present in Orange County, doesn't indicate Costa Mesa. So I think I know your answer, but are you aware of any evidence of racial animus in our literature in Costa Mesa?
Commissioner Zick, I'm not, I would say no, although there are items like we brought up earlier this year as a result of a change of state law last year regarding like sidewalk vending and things like that. I have heard that described as issues related to more cultural, I guess, than racial issues, but I have heard those kind of complaints. I think there's probably some legitimacy to that. It's different cultures have different norms as how businesses can be carried out in their community. So I think there's some of that occurs. I don't think, I have not heard anything along those lines of regarding the zoning ordinance itself. That specific item is not in the zoning ordinance, it's elsewhere in the municipal code. But so I'm not aware of any to answer your specific question, but I have seen a few smaller items that are in the municipal code that have been addressed in the last year or two.
So I want to ask a little bit about the R1 zone. And the reference is on pages 2 and 3 of the memo having to do with the Mesa Verde a tract as the example. And I can certainly understand how as the cities became more densely populated and tracts began to get built in maybe even a cookie cutter fashion in some cases, that homes were in very close proximity to each other. And this, I find it interesting, sometimes this is where you find laws on the books that don't even apply to our current culture about where you can tie up your horse, for example, or things like that. But we have a parent exclusion that says you can't have horses, cattle, swine, sheep, goats, chicken, or rabbits on your 6,000 square foot single family home lot here in Costa Mesa. Now, I don't know that to be unreasonable. And I don't know that to be evidence of a systematic inequality or institutional racism. Do you find any trouble with that exclusion, or does that exclusion make sense to you? That no horses, cattle, swine, sheep, goats, chickens, or rabbits can, I guess, be raised and potentially slaughtered for food or sold for money? Does it seem like a unreasonable restriction to you?
Commissioner Zick, those are relatively normal restrictions in residential areas. So because they're relatively normal, I've never given a lot of thought to any impetus behind them other than nuisances associated with those types of uses as far as odors and noises and things like that. So I'm not aware of, one, I find it reasonable, but mainly because it's what I'm used to. And two, I'm not aware of any other motive for that other than what I just said.
Now, there's another exclusion here we don't give a lot of attention to, but I've got a question about it because I think it's been updated, and it says no business establishment of any nature. Now, I know there's a lot of people that have home businesses, and in order to get a license to do that, you actually have to fill out a form at the city and describe the nature of your business. And I think somebody might claim or think that not being able to run a business out of your house would be an exclusionary practice. If I was an auto mechanic, for example, and I wanted to have a auto repair operation on my property, in my driveway, in my garage, in my front yard, you're probably not going to let me do that, right? And what would be the reason why you might not let me do that?
That's a question, sorry. Commissioner, with typical Euclidean type zoning where we have mixtures of uses, basically, and we do allow the home occupations as you indicated, but it's very limited. So it's someone running a business out of their house that doesn't have customers coming to their home and things like that. So it's something that for all intents and purposes looks like someone's just in their house. They just happen to be there more than somebody that goes to work during the day. The reason those other uses are typically not allowed in residential areas, similar to residences maybe not being allowed in a heavy industrial area, was at least the prevailing thought when zoning took place was that you could end up with noxious type uses that are incompatible with people living and domiciling in an area. So things like, an obvious example would be if your neighbor wanted to do, cattle rendering in their property, you could see that would make an almost unlivable circumstance for the neighbors. Or if, my neighbor is not an auto mechanic, but he plays one on TV, I think, because he's always tearing cars apart in his front yard, drives me nuts. And, the constant grinding and banging and other things are a nuisance. So that's typically why those types of uses aren't allowed in residential zones. Again, like I said, there are other uses that wouldn't be allowed in commercial zones and industrial zones. It tries to limit similar type uses. Now, at a dark line separation, I think some of those things have been rethought over the years, where mixed uses and things are starting to be encouraged. And even I think most people in my profession would argue that in a lot of cases, it's good to combine some uses together and have uses that are at least complementary near each other. I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay. And I wanted to ask you about this. And again, I want to thank Commissioner Perkins for this discussion on equality and equity. I think you're right that on the surface, those two words sound the same and might be used interchangeably. And I think I will probably have your little diagram of the bicycles now burned into my brain to sort of give one way to differentiate between those two. But what that reminds me of, and I think your comment about fairness is important, and maybe the distinction that is important. But there's another idea that's related to that, a couple of words that are related to that, that I want to get a reaction to. And maybe Commissioner Perkins, this maybe would be a kind of a question to you to see if you have thoughts about this. But I've heard it said, and I understood the basis for this little phrase, the idea that, you know, we have this concept in our country of equal opportunity. And I think that, you know, they're big words, they're simple words, they roll off the tongue easy, and it probably means different things to different people. But I don't think equal opportunity is the same thing as equal outcome. So if a person looked enviously at that beautiful 5,000 square foot home on the bluffs in Newport Beach overlooking the ocean, said, hey, how come I can't live there? What's wrong with this country? I mean, what happened to equal opportunity? A flippant response might be, well, it was on the market last week. You had the opportunity to put in an offer. That house could have been yours. And then a response to that might say, yeah, well, wait a minute. There's income inequality. And the income inequality is a long tradition in this country, and that prevents the person from being able to put in an offer on that house overlooking the ocean. And part of the question that I have about that for you is this: is there a distinction in your mind between income inequality? And I know there's a whole political party movement that is you know, all about income inequality. If you've watched any of the politicians, you know some of the people I'm referring to. But do you see a distinction between income inequality and institutional racism?
So I think it's a very big and good question. I would say when we're thinking about this from an equity perspective, I think there are many lenses that one can use. And so when we're looking at the question of sort of housing equity, I think one way that I would answer that is we're looking at it as potentially, you know, income inequities have part of it, but so does race, so does culture, all of these other elements of that. So I think that when we are looking at our policies as a city, we need to look at our policies and see, do they treat people equitably? And one of those could be income and class related, which definitely address the R1 zoning that you've been asking about that. But I think it's one portion of the discussion. Does that answer your question?
It partially does. And would you say the emphasis of what you're trying to propose here is that we, to the extent that it might exist, because we really don't know if it does. In fact, we have no evidence yet that it does exist in our city codes. But to the extent that it does exist, is it your interest in rooting out the systemic inequality and the institutional racism? Or are you looking at tackling income inequality in all matters of social equity?
I think for this commission in particular, I think we're looking at, I think what I am looking at is an analysis of our, say, housing policy, zoning codes, business development codes, with an eye to equity. I think as Director Curtis had mentioned, is there going to be very much explicit racism in our codes? I think no. I think that has been probably cleared out. But when you look at these elements with an eye to equity, with an eye to, wait a minute, these groups, be they racial, be they cultural or ethnic or class-based, do not have equal access to, or do not have equal, even potentially outcomes under this. So I would say, to answer your question directly, we are looking specifically at our policies here in the city of Costa Mesa related to things that this commission has authority over or authority to provide feedback on.
Okay, thank you for that. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's it for now.
Thank you, Commissioner Zick. Commissioner Tourget, you have questions.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. I will start with a quick comment to give some background on my question. 2 years ago, I was able to be in Montgomery, Alabama to see what's commonly known as the Lynching Memorial. It's the Equal Justice Initiative looking at lynching in America. And it was a stunning experience, a heartbreaking experience. And then I spent the next 2 days driving through the South, going to some family's house. And it was my first time in that area, and it was a lot to start in Montgomery. But what I did while I was driving was, I'm a researcher and I love data, and I ended up looking county by county at the counties that I drove through and looked to see their history. And I was struck by a county that had 0 Black people who lived in that county, when in the 1940s, it was 70% Black. And a series of incidents of like night riders came into the community and burned people's homes down, and everyone left. And to this day, there are no Black people who live in that county in Georgia. And I think about that because I drove through thinking, like, what a beautiful place. So as we're talking about code that was written in the 20s and 30s and implemented into or racial covenants that were enforced into the 50s and 60s, if people aren't allowed to be in the community, one of the reasons why we don't have a large population of Black and African American people in our community is because they were not welcome for a long period of time. And that welcome now might not be very apparent. So I have a couple questions, because when we're talking about equity, we're not just talking, we are talking about Black folks in our community, but we're also talking about other people of color. And so I would like to ask the staff, I know the answer to this, but I'll ask just as this is just to understand a little bit. What is the population of Spanish-speaking community in Costa Mesa? Or what is the population of people who identify as Hispanic in the city of Costa Mesa?
Jennifer, do you have a number for that? Otherwise, we'd have to look that up, I think, Commissioner Tourget, unless you know, Jennifer.
I don't know offhand. If you'll give me a few minutes, I'll take a look at our documentation and see if I can come back with an answer.
Great. And the latest ACS data that I've seen is 31.6% of the population is Hispanic. My second question is, does the city translate documents from the Planning Commission into Spanish?
Commissioner Tourget, we don't translate documents from the Planning Commission into Spanish. Certain notifications, depending on what the item is, are translated, and that's on a case-by-case basis.
If someone requested materials from the Planning Commission to be translated in Spanish, would those documents be translated into Spanish?
So the city has various personnel that are identified who can do translation services for the city. We haven't had those types of requests commonly in the past, but certainly if there was a request for a specific document, we would communicate with that person who made the request and figure out what to do from there.
Thank you. Is that advertised anywhere that there is the opportunity for people to have documents translated for them?
It's probably not overtly communicated in that way, but there are generally references to translation services on the city's website and elsewhere.
Great. Is there live interpretation available at Planning Commission meetings?
Now there is not.
Was there in the past?
Brenda could perhaps speak to the past a little better than I could, but there hasn't been consistently Spanish translation in sort of a live format like we're doing now.
Excuse me, this is Brenda, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. We do notice on all our public notices and all our agendas about translation services. And yes, we do have the City Clerk's office just finished with one employee completing 2 years Spanish interpretation program. So those are available. So if somebody does request to have Spanish translation at meetings, then we can have a translator there that's on staff. And we have had it at some of our larger public hearings regarding the Fairview Developmental Center, regarding more ceremonial events. When some of our new council members were in, then we had translation services available. Also on our website, we do have the capability for people to change languages for items posted on our website.
Okay, thank you so much. Are in any of those notices offering translation, is the offer of translation in Spanish?
We don't clarify in Spanish, we just clarify if you need translation services. So we used to have to have Vietnamese translation available to our public notices, like my election public notices in Spanish and Vietnamese. But now we don't need to do it in Vietnamese anymore. And so it would just most likely be in Spanish. Occasionally here at City Hall, we get some callers and inquiries in different languages like Vietnamese or Korean, but mostly it would be in Spanish.
Okay, great. I've personally had to translate for City Council before, and so I was just wondering if there was that now in current times. My next question is, do we know the percentage of people of color in our single family zoned districts versus our districts that have a higher concentration of multifamily? And you might not know the answer to this, but I'm just asking the question.
I'm not aware of it offhand. We could do the research. We have the data to do that, but I'm not aware of it.
Okay. And then just to confirm a question that was asked before, is my business my white collar consulting business that I have a home occupancy license for in Costa Mesa permitted in Costa Mesa?
Presumably.
Okay.
Yes, Commissioner. Home occupations are permitted. Okay. There is a process, but they're permitted.
Okay. I ask those questions and I ask them in a serious way because when we talk about systemic inequality, there's things that we well-intentioned and systematically do that contribute to systematic inequality, but we wouldn't call it that. We would just say the way we do it is have materials available in English, and until there's an issue or until there's a problem or until there's a lawsuit, we change those items. And so I brought up that one piece of in-language translation because sometimes it's hard to see what we're talking about when we talk about, or when people talk about systemic inequality. So those are my questions, and I bring them up in relation to the Planning Commission and not relation to other items in the city because that is our purview. And I just want to thank both Ms. Lee and Ms. Green for answering my questions that came a little bit rapid fire. I really appreciate the work that you do and your willingness to answer.
Hey, commissioners, Commissioner Zick, before I go back to you, I'm gonna see if there's any other commissioners who have questions.
I just had a quick comment.
Well, hold on a second.
All right.
Commissioners, any questions of either Commissioner Perkins or staff? Okay, seeing no one, Commissioner Zick, if you have a comment.
Just noticed on page 2 of our agenda, paragraph number 5, the offer of interpretive services is actually made in Spanish.
Okay.
That's all I wanted to say.
Vice Chair Harlan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a long conversation with Commissioner Perkins this afternoon. Mostly we dealt more with mechanics of the proposal, but what I want to talk about tonight, and I think it's highlighted by a lot of the questions of my fellow commissioners, and especially by Commissioner Tourget and her, I think, very excellent line of questioning, is the notion of what does equity mean to us, and I mean all of us in Costa Mesa. I think we're making the assumption that it's an important value, and I think that's a fair assumption, but I don't think we are operating from a common definition. So I think that's a preliminary step that as a city we need to take. The question becomes, how do we do that and in what context? And I think for the purposes of the Planning Commission, Commissioner Perkins had offered a suggestion, and it, I will admit had some input from our conversation, so I appreciate that, about finding a way for either a subcommittee of the Planning Commission or even individual commissioners coming together to set up some kind of framework for analysis. And I think the words that he had used were guiding principles, which I think is appropriate. So to my mind, we have some established processes. So we are going to have a housing element that's going to be prepared shortly. And I think it's a critical process for Costa Mesa's future. There's a lot at stake with this housing element. And we are certainly hearing from Sacramento how important it is. I think from a practical standpoint, it really is going to underscore how we plan on developing and growing in the city to address not just our housing issues, but in my mind, some equity issues. So I think as a subcommittee could have the charge, and this is maybe a suggestion for how we move forward. If we do create some sort of subcommittee or a handful of commissioners, look at defining what equity is first. And then secondly, coming up with a set of guiding principles for that, for example, for the housing element. How are we going to incorporate equity into that housing element process? Now, I have no idea what that looks like right now. I don't want to make any presumptions about it, but I think it's worthy of conversation. And it's not just something that should be confined to the Planning Commission. I think it's vital if equity is a value that's important to Costa Mesa, we need to get additional input. And I think that if a group is successful in doing this, we might be able to create what I would consider a portable analytical tool. If we've got some guiding principles that could be applied to the housing element, they could be possibly applied to an economic development strategy or a specific plan. To my mind, the idea is to get something in place that we can use across the board, but that we have some buy-in from our community. Now, having said that, the Planning Commission is an appointed body. So we are not the policymakers for the city, but I think we have some expertise and some experience that we can lend to this discussion. So I think if we do something, we would keep in mind that this is a recommendation to council, and the council will figure out if it's something that they want to proceed with. So those are my comments at the moment, and I sincerely invite some discussion about this because I think it is very important. We're coming from very different perspectives, but I think there's something worthwhile to develop here.
Thank you, Vice Chair. So I have a few thoughts. I noted that a lot of the, or large component of Commissioner Perkins' work on the memo attachment 1 in our staff report was related to housing, particularly references to R1 and I guess equitable opportunities for housing in Costa Mesa. I tend to look at that from my perspective with respect to income equity or income equality rather than based on an ethnic framework, although I understand income inequality in minority communities is certainly prevalent. A lot more work needs to be done there. I know of many Black community members, Jewish community members, Hispanic and Latino community members who are homeowners in Costa Mesa's R1 neighborhoods. I don't know that that necessarily says anything whether we have, whether R1 zoning on its face lends itself to some kind of discrimination based on ethnicity. It certainly can based on class, but that's really a function of the market. So I'm going to piggyback on what Vice Chair Harlan says. I really think that the upcoming housing element and what will likely be a housing element that is so significant in the paradigm shift it will represent to the city that it will have implications for other elements within the general plan that will require general plan amendments, which is all basically to say that this is a larger legislative action that's going to be taking place one pay grade above us at the city council level. But I think we have an opportunity relative to Commissioner Perkins' initiative here from the housing perspective to have an honest look at that housing element and the zoning codes behind it and the development standards behind them, the densities we allow, whether or not we have an inclusionary housing ordinance and what that looks like. I think in order to create greater equity for home ownership or rental opportunities in Costa Mesa, those things are important and are going to be very important in this next housing element. Having said that, put that aside, and I think that's I think to me, that's the really important point. I think the other elements that Commissioner Perkins has brought up in his memo are sort of outside our purview. And to kind of follow along what Vice Chair Harlan said about what is equitable. I mean, we all would probably have different opinions about that. I'm going to suggest that rather than the commission forming a subcommittee, that we ask the city council to consider the formation of a human relations committee within the city. That would essentially be a more comprehensive look, or a committee that looks holistically at all 20 titles within our municipal code, not just the zoning code. There's tons of cities that have human relations commissions, Beverly Hills, Long Beach, LA, Riverside. And so I'm going to ask maybe that the commission consider asking the, well, I don't even know that we need to do that. I would think maybe even Commissioner Perkins has been so proactive and out front on this, and depending on how we couch this, if he writes a letter to the council, I would consider signing it, essentially requesting that the council consider the formation of a human relations committee that looks at Costa Mesa, all 20 titles in the municipal code for systemic inequality or ways we can make ourselves better. Like I said, I think Costa Mesa in my 27 years is probably one of the most diverse, progressive, open communities in Orange County. But we can always do better. We can always do better. And I don't want to assume that we can't do better. But I'm not sure the focus that Commissioner Perkins has brought to us, it's almost like it's mile marker 4 when we're starting out at mile marker 0. And I think a kind of human relations committee established by the city council would be a better place to start and establish that framework of what is equality, what do we want to achieve from an economic development perspective, from a housing perspective, from accessible public transportation perspective, from a parks and recreation perspective. I think if we want to do this right, and like I said, in a holistic manner, I would rather sit down with Commissioner Perkins and say, let's come up with a proposal to the city council where we formally ask them to consider that. Whether or not that needs to come from us in a formal action tonight, I don't know. I'll leave it up to you guys to weigh in and offer your ideas. But I think rather than a subcommittee or a committee of the Planning Commission, I think really what we need to do is think about establishing a human relations committee and have that be more of a body, couple of council members, couple of planning commissioners, couple of parks and recreation commissioners, business leaders, and then some at-large community members. Obviously, the minority community is well representative. And let's have that committee start the work of a broad view of what equity means to Costa Mesa, what we want it to mean, and then how that trickles down to all the policies and regulations we put in place, from housing to parks and rec to business, economic development, permit fees, all that stuff. So that's my 2 cents. On free to listen to any other commissioners if they have comments. Raise your hand if you want to talk. Commissioner Russell and then Vice Chair Harlan.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Chair. One of my concerns about this proposal was it seemed once I started thinking about it, it got bigger and bigger and bigger in terms of from my perspective. I mean, we have a certain component of public outreach and getting public feedback, but it goes so much farther than that. I mean, some of the things that it does touch on are, as we've spoken about, just the way we talk about home ownership versus rental. And there's kind of an underlying theme that homeowners are better than renters. And it's not overt, but it just kind of comes up. And that in some ways, does that make renters feel like, oh, we don't want to hear what they have to say? When we have these meetings about the future of the city, do they feel that they will be listened to? Are their thoughts going to be put into place? Are we asking them questions about what they would like? And I don't know, human relations, we may want to look at a different title for it, because I'm not sure. Sometimes I think that when we say something that's a committee that's been other times, other places, that they may just fall into a similar pattern to other human relations, and we may miss the boat again. But I do think that that's a good point to broaden it out and to look at the city as a whole, and that's beyond what we're, our assignment. So just a couple of comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Colbert.
So thank you, Commissioner Perkins, for pulling together this document. I think it's a really important document. The research and feedback and what you have received from this, I think, adds to the value of it. In addition to the citations, I think it are all, regardless of age, things that we can learn from, and I think speak to the importance of a committee like this being formed. I think my question to staff would be, I think, something similar to what Commissioner Harlan stated about what this looks like in play. How we articulate this. What are the particular actions that this body, be it a subcommittee or ad hoc committee or whichever term or framework we want to call it, and understanding what the deliverable looks like. Is it a work product? Is it a planning document that we sit on a shelf and don't do anything? Is it incorporated into our general plan? How does this become a committee or working group that also is able to, one of my concerns is to freely work and think and talk without the restrictions of, I think the Brown Act is one of my major things, is we can come together and deliberate as a body. I think the conversations that I want to have specifically with commissioners to better understand perspective, I'll use that, requires much more than a 3-minute talk or comment. And I think that if we're restricted by that or this forum, we won't really be able to have, I think, the type of dialogue that needs to take place, or the depth of dialogue that needs to take place, or the honesty and transparency that we may want to bring forward that people may not be comfortable with in various forums. And so my question to staff is, how have you seen a commission develop a committee in which they are able to meet with community members where they are able to engage on a specific topic, similar to maybe like a screening? And if so, what did that look like, and how did it function in terms of providing a deliverable to the committee?
So, Mr. Curtis, if you have an answer for that, and I also would like to hear from Mr. Preziosi relative to the Brown Act, as Commissioner Colbert brought up, but just generally legal issues we have to be cognizant of as we consider such a committee.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Colbert, I'll talk about the first part. I'll leave the legal Brown Act part to Tarquin, since he got called upon. More likely than not, everything we're talking about tonight is something that's going to be taken to the City Council for their recommendation and their determination as far as what constitutes, whether it be a subcommittee or a committee or some other type of body. So I think everything we're talking about needs to be run through the City Council for its authorization. There's nothing in the Brown Act that really limits speaking to 3 minutes or those things. Those are different committees and commissions and councils determine how long they want to allow communications so they can run an orderly meeting. So there's nothing that would preclude a committee or subcommittee, even if it was under the Brown Act, from allowing people to talk, for as long as they wanted. It's just, the meetings get somewhat lengthy that way, potentially. Right. But you could have, 1 or 2 speakers specific to come and speak at, from the community at certain nights and give them 30 minutes. And there's multiple ways you could do that. And with that, I'll turn it back to Tarquin for a minute, or I'll turn it over to Tarquin for a minute to talk about Constitution of Brown Act, and if there's any types of committees that get outside of the Brown Act. Typically some ad hoc committees can, I think, but I'll leave that to Tarquin, and then I'll circle back at the end if there's anything I need to add on to that. You're still muted, Tarquin.
Thank you. I'm used to having this on mute. So the Brown Act will generally not apply to an ad hoc committee that is a committee of limited duration for a single purpose that does not have a regularly fixed meeting and is not composed of a majority of the members of the Planning Commission. That being said, if the commission, if such an ad hoc committee, we're going to have meetings, I would suggest that they do be agendized. They do allow for public comment. And as very accurately said, that public comment and the length of time given to that public comment would be prescribed by the ad hoc committee. It's not limited to 3 minutes. 3 minutes is set by the Planning Commission, 3 minutes is set by the City Council, but there are many other bodies that don't follow that 3 minutes. It's not set forth in state law anywhere. It's at the pleasure of the committee itself. another comment I'd like to make is if whether or not this potential ad hoc committee, if that's what is formed, is subject to the Brown Act, I think it makes a great deal of sense to make it subject to the Brown Act, because I think if the goal of such a committee is to make it inclusionary, you'd certainly want to have public notifications, and you certainly want to have public notifications so that community members could freely participate, as opposed to a research group that would go out and just target selective audiences and get feedback. I don't think that would be inclusionary. I'm not saying it would be illegal, but I don't think it would be inclusionary. I don't think it would be in the spirit of what I think is being contemplated. But if there are any more specific questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
So, Mr. Preziosi, just as a, so typically an ad hoc committee set up by either a legislative body or an advisory body in a jurisdiction, is it required or advisable to either have staff support for those or legal counsel?
I would suggest ultimately whether or not to have legal counsel, that's a decision of the city council. But I would strongly suggest that there always be staff present. And the reason, one of the major reasons for that is to ensure that the Brown Act is followed, and whether or not the Brown Act actually applies to the meeting, because you don't want to make the meeting subject to the Brown Act. So I think there always needs to be staff present. I'm not aware of any similar type of ad hoc committees here in Costa Mesa where staff isn't present or at least available to assist the committee.
Okay.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I did have
Commissioner Colbert, sure, go ahead.
Okay, Mr. Curtis, in terms of economic development in the city, you spoke about, or maybe Chair DeArco mentioned the diversity of that. Could you provide, or is there any data related to the diversity of maybe the chamber or economic development or businesses who owns them in the city?
Again, offhand, I don't have the data with us, and I'm not positive that the city's business license data gets to that level of information. It's possible from looking at various census tools that we may have some information as to minority ownership, women ownership, and things like that of businesses. But offhand, I don't have that information.
Okay. In terms of sober living facilities, we've all heard from communities and advocates of that particular policy and that proposal. Was there any, and maybe Tarquin can speak to this, was there any suits or any legislation, not legislation, legal action filed against the city at any time in reference to the prohibition or prevention of those potentially from coming into the city at any time?
So, Commissioner Colbert, there's been a great deal of litigation filed against the city by sober living homes, none of which have been successful at this point. Many are still ongoing. The city has had some victories in state and federal court, as I'm sure you're aware. But to answer your question, yes, there are a number of lawsuits currently pending against the city from sober living home or sober living home operators.
All right, back to you, Mr. Curtis. Would you characterize those suits, those legal suits, in any way as a fight for equity?
You know, Commissioner Colbert and Tarquin may jump in here because I'm not a lawyer. I wouldn't have Mr. Curtis answer that question because litigation is ongoing.
Thank you, Chair. I would concur with that. I don't think this is really the focus of the Planning Commission meetings here tonight. We're, of course, happy to answer any factual-based questions, but I think we're veering towards matters that are, in fact, in litigation would not be a proper subject for questions to staff at this point.
Okay. I'm not sure that I agree with that, but the question of equity, I think, was presented, and what equity looks like and how we define it. And so I think it's a fair question, given that we've had issues of people coming before the commission presenting issues of equity and access to living in this community based off of their conditions and challenges with the Fair Housing Act of 1965. And so in terms of the average age in this community, do we know the average age of the population, Mr. Curtis? Or
So we have some data, Commissioner Colbert, as to age distribution in the city. If you'll give me a couple moments, I can summarize that at the end of the meeting.
Okay. And I asked those two questions because I believe the responses earlier to those questions were that we had not had issues of equity or challenges to the city. And so I just wanted to note that we've had those. We've had challenges of equity. Maybe they weren't racially based. Maybe they looked in class. Maybe they were different things, but their issues of equity of people trying to live and function in this community. You know, maybe it wasn't simply reduced to color, and we can't. This isn't about color. It's deeper. It's more systemic. It goes, you know, further than that. So, I don't want this to become, and I think Charlie Arco spoke to it, solely about race. It is a larger issue, but I think that some of the historic issues in our country and in this city are solely challenged by race. And this is a difficult conversation for me, I must add, because my experience in this city as a Black man for 2.5 maybe years has been riddled with experiences of bias. And that's what I would call them, experiences of bias. And people don't want to hear that, and they don't want to see it. And I try to get through, you know, and navigate these certain, but this is it might not be as apparent to others how the experience of navigating this country, this city, this community looks, but it is very different. So it is triggering often to have those situations and circumstances reduced or minimalized to just flippant responses. And so I think that's where we go to the unlearning and hearing each other. And I'm willing to listen and learn and love and grow together as a community. But we have to be honest about and transparent about the issues that have existed in Costa Mesa, in this country, in this state. And as progressive as we think we are, as liberal as we think we are, and as thoughtful, we're still able to count the 1 or 2 or 3 people that are Latinx that serve on our council or have served in leadership. That's not, to me, in any way remarkable at all. And it does me no justice to think that we can still count the amount of people who have served, because that's not equity. And I'll stop there, but I just want to know this is so important. And I think it was stated by Commissioner Zick that this is probably one of the most important. This is something that I value the most. And that's why I know what my first question was, what does this look like at the end of the day? I don't want to participate in another conversation. I don't want to participate in another dialogue unless it's going to come out to be something with action. I think there can be things that can be found within this document where we can find action. I apologize. Well, I don't apologize. But thank you for listening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Colbert. Commissioner Zick and then Vice Chair Harlan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So let me start by saying that Commissioner Colbert, I would like to be able to change your mind and have you want to have more conversation. And the reason why I would want you to have more conversation is to help me and to help others understand more about the opinions and experiences and ideas that you have. I understand I can hear the range of passionate emotions that you have on this subject and the strong desire for action. And I just think that to get action is going to require more conversation so we can figure out collectively what that effective action is. I liked a lot of what Vice Chair Harlan said and what Chair DeErickle said. And as they were both talking, I kind of wrote down the 3 questions that I felt that their words were saying to me. Who are we? Who do we want to be? And what do we want to do about that? And how are we going to get there? I think clearly from the discussion and from the documentation, this isn't a race discussion. This isn't just an income inequality discussion. And I think Commissioner Russell really made the point that the more you look at this, and these are kind of my words, but from her comment, the more you look at this, the bigger it is, the broader it is, almost to the point where it could feel like you're trying to boil the ocean. And I think if there was to be a subcommittee or group of people working on something, I think the biggest challenge is to scope it to a mission. In my career, I have been involved in the formation of so many teams, and I have seen others form so many teams. And the worst thing you can do is set up a team that has an ambiguous or unattainable mission. So I think the idea that Chairman DeErickle offered in terms of sitting down with Commissioner Perkins to try to craft a sort of a narrower or a more succinct or a clearer ask just makes a lot of sense. And I think that I won't make a motion yet because I see others want to comment, but I can see that it would be important for the council to really discuss and decide, and maybe not even in front of a not maybe even an agendized item. If we make a formal recommendation here, it shows up as an agendized item. If the way Chairman DeErickle was discussing an approach, it could be a letter to council, and some council member decides, hey, I'm interested in this. I'm interested in moving something forward. Let me kind of put the idea together so when a staff report shows up on the agenda for council, it really has a clear, narrowly defined, achievable scope. And whether you call it the Human Relations Committee, or you call it some subcommittee of the commission, planning commission, or some other mechanism, I just think that would be more effective. I don't want to shelve the work. I want to move it forward. I think this is, and I'll repeat, I think this is one of the most important things we could be undertaking as a planning commission. I think the housing element is going to be critical. And I think the entire planning commission needs to be involved in that with staff, rather than just have the thing show up on an agenda sometime in the future. I think we should have multiple study sessions where we're involved in it. We're looking at it, we're studying. We become almost as expert as staff is in what it is and how it's achieving the types of goals and the areas of interest that have been expressed by the different commissioners. I don't think 3 people going off and trying to design a utopia is going to be the most effective way to get the buy-in from the community and the rest of the commission and council. So I'll hold off on any motion. Somebody else might have one. I'll let others speak.
Commissioner Perkins, Vice Chair Harlan, and then Commissioner Perkins.
Actually, Mr. Chair, I see Commissioner Perkins' virtual hand raised. I'd defer to him first to respond, and then I may have some comments.
By all means, Commissioner Perkins.
Great, thank you. Fantastic discussion and comments. I really appreciate all this. I definitely agree that the discussion can easily go well beyond what we have as our sort of mission as a planning commission. I do really like the idea of a citywide commission or committee looking at equity or whatever that name would be, human relations or equity, since there are so many elements and so many important pieces of this puzzle that need to be looked at. I think one thing that I guess I see the need for that, and I think I would be very excited to have this group make that recommendation if people agree with that. The one concern I have on that is that with regard to the housing element in particular, which is definitely, as you saw, where a lot of my energy was focused as well, that is coming up exceptionally quickly. And so I fear that if we were to wait for that group might not even be formed or missioned or whatnot until the housing element was already running. So I wonder if we could do a dual approach of recommending a citywide council on this, because as we're quickly learning through our discussion, it touches all elements of the city and is an issue that is important and relevant to many of our residents. But also maybe potentially have a couple of us start looking at what does this look like in the context of the housing element. So when that starts up in, I think, only a month or two, we at least are on the ground running with an idea of metrics and background research and whatnot. So that's my thought.
Okay, before I get to you, Vice Chair, Mr. Curtis, if I could have you, if you know, pencil out a rough timeline for the housing element, and also the extent, the scope of work for the RFP on the housing element includes community outreach.
Mr. Chairman, the housing element update is required to be completed by October of 2021, unless the state changes its mind and grants some sort of relief to cities. So we are bringing a contract for a consultant to help staff prepare the housing element update in July to the City Council in July. The plan is to have that consultant lead a very robust public participation process over the entire course of developing the housing element update. What I think maybe makes some sense, I understand what Commissioner Perkins was suggesting. What perhaps makes some sense is if the commission was to recommend to the City Council some type of new committee, whether it be human relations or whatever, would also be, to the extent that the commission is at a point or could be at the point in the next meeting or two, to formulate some additional recommendations to the City Council as things that should be considered through the housing element update process, as well as a number of other processes that are kind of going along in tandem or parallel to that. We're bringing forward or developing an inclusionary housing ordinance. I think that would follow some of this line of reasoning as well. City Council has also discussed its desire to move forward with visioning for a number of the corridors in the city, and maybe a relook at a number of the urban plans. So I think to the extent the commission can recommend certain aspects that are important, that those be considered in those processes, I think it might make sense to recommend the council specifically include those elements in the public participation process and the development of those other documents as well.
Okay. Vice Chair Harlan and then Commissioner Tourget. Thank you, Mr. Curtis, for your response. That kind of helps me formulate some ways I'm thinking on this. Thank you. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what I've heard from my colleagues is that we're largely talking about form. What is the vehicle to communicate the importance of equity, and how do we define that? And everybody's come up with great suggestions. After the chair offered his, I was saying that's a great idea. I'd like to have something that's more broad-minded, and the idea of bringing together representatives from the Planning Commission with the Parks Commission and others, I think would be fruitful. And I think that we all have some measure of expertise that we can lend to that. And personally, I like those conversations. But I am mindful of the fact that we have very limited staff resources. So I don't want to overburden staff with anything. And even though that's not my decision, certainly it's council's, I want to be cognizant of that. On the other hand, I feel like this is a time where action is needed, that we do need to start somewhere and initiate some kind of definition of equity, some kind of way to guide some decision making here. And to me, it seems like it's natural that the housing element, because it's coming up so quickly, will be that prime opportunity. I don't want us to get mired though in process. I really feel like, you know, we have to start somewhere, and even if we stumble, there's time to make some corrections and move forward. So I take to heart Commissioner Colbert's concerns about let's just do something, because I think it's needed. But if anything, this conversation just highlights to me that we have a lot of intelligent, thoughtful, passionate, committed people who are going to participate, no matter what. So I don't know that the form is critical. I just think that we need to be able to find a way to participate and invest, but also have some goal in mind. You know, we can, I used to manage general plan updates for cities, and these are multi-year, multi-million-dollar projects. And you start with this very broad approach to city planning, and you have to kind of narrow it down to something that you can do on an actionable item basis. I hate the phrase of, you know, how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time. I prefer to think of it as you have to start with some small incremental steps and really move forward, but have an understanding that there's a larger vision associated with that. There has to be something that ties everything together. So without rambling too much more about this, I don't have a proposed solution for it. What I do think that if I'm the city council and I'm listening to this conversation, that we have people who are interested, it's an important issue. We need to find some way to move it forward. And I will leave it at that for now.
Okay, thank you, Vice Chair. Commissioner Tourget.
Thank you. I did have a question going back to the housing element update and the robust outreach plan that would go with it. Do we have an idea of what would take place as part of that robust outreach program?
Jennifer, can you talk to the scope of services for that? And I know it's not fully developed.
Right, so the staff has received proposals. We've evaluated the proposals for the housing element, and our intent is to make a recommendation to the city council, which includes a professional services agreement. So as part of that, staff has had conversations with our prospective consultant as to what that scope of work might look like. It's not necessarily finalized, but as a general outline, the idea and what is typical for housing many times is to start out the process with some basic data gathering, and then to follow up with a community workshop or a series of community workshops generally designed to hear what is important to the community as we start going into the phase of evaluating programs and policies for the housing element. So there's typically an opportunity at the beginning of the housing element for that type of information gathering from the community. It usually takes the form of a number of community workshops. Then the consultant and staff go into a phase where we're essentially developing what we would perceive to be the housing needs of the community based both on the feedback that we receive at the workshops as well as based on the data gathering phase of the housing element update. Following, we prepare a draft of the city's housing policies, actions, and programs. And we essentially do a second round of community workshops to receive feedback on what those recommendations at the end of the day would look like and how they would read and be incorporated into the housing element. Following, there's the typical public hearing process, which includes planning commission hearings as well as city council hearings. Ultimately, a draft of the housing element is submitted to the State Department of Housing and Community Development for their feedback as well. And the city receives a letter of certification, essentially, that we've completed the housing element process. So that's sort of the gamut of what we expect to accomplish. Community workshops have a place in and are part of the scope of services in every housing proposal that we're considering. So that is our intention, to use those venues to receive feedback from the community.
And Ms. Lee, I would add as well, because of the size of the arena and the anticipated difficulties of this particular housing element, staff has applied for a grant to do additional land use element and other general plan potential changes and zoning changes to implement the housing element on the heels of that, which we also anticipate having additional public processes.
Great, thank you. And I understand that consultants equal money, and public outreach oftentimes means funding. And so my encouragement would always be to, as part of those public workshops, be working with local community groups and partners to get the word out and consider folks that aren't going to be involved in it. So I'm gratified to hear that it's more than just like a stakeholder forum, but there's actually community workshops. And I'm definitely interested in keeping my eye and ear on what that outreach looks like, and appreciate the word robust.
And Chair and Commissioners, I think a number of commissioners had questions this evening that were more sort of data-based. I'll just go through a quick summary of the information that I have. Much of the information that I'll describe here is based on information that's in the housing element, and that's largely based on census data, which hasn't been updated quite yet in some time. But there are, for example, American community surveys that sort of do periodic updates in between census, in between the census of 2010 and 2020. So I think we had a question earlier as to sort of language distribution. Approximately 60% of the city is primarily English speaking, with approximately 30% Spanish speaking, and then the remainder distributed among a number of languages. And we also had a question regarding age distribution. Our median age in the city is approximately 35 years old, and the age distribution of the city is also broken down in terms of age brackets. So I can go through those if you like, but I can also send an informational email after this meeting that sort of summarizes the details of that. But generally the median age is 35. We do not have, Commissioner Torjay, a breakdown of race categories by land use type or by housing type. I'll look into a little more the data sources that we have and see if I can get a little closer to an answer on that one. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Zick and then Commissioner Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start by thanking you for your patience in moderating this meeting so far. I think
I raised 4 kids. I had to have patience.
All right. I don't like the analogy, but I accept it. I'm supportive of forming committees and subcommittees to look at this stuff. And I'm not opposed to ambiguity or unclear charter or a broad spectrum of topics that might be looked at. But what I am concerned about is a couple of things. And those with an engineering background will understand and appreciate that form follows function. Form is important, but that comes after function. You first have to figure out what it is you're trying to accomplish. And in my mind, we're trying to accomplish a couple of things. Clearly, we want more engagement from the community. We absolutely have to have buy-in from the community. We clearly recognize the council has to make a decision, whether it's to form a subcommittee, whether it's to form a new human relations committee or something like that. So we need the council buy-in. Well, here's what I'm concerned about is if we make a formal recommendation out of the Planning Commission and pass it up to council, my concern is that we're kicking and ambiguous can up onto their plate. And if they try doing what we're doing right now, their discussion would be as long or longer, would be as varied, it'd be alpha to omega, just like our discussion has been. And I think it is more, I'm gonna use the term staff, but I mean little staff. I don't mean the city staff that we have. I think there's some more staff work that has to take place to describe more clearly what it is we want the council to do. This is a responsible council we've got. They're not just going to form some subcommittee or let us form one and then, you know, let us just run around and go do stuff. They're going to want something specific, something actionable, something deliverable. It's a smart council that we've got. And to help them, I think two things have to happen. I think one is that that information has to be succinctly described, and with all due respect, I think this document doesn't do that. There's just too much in it, the way it's currently formulated. So I think that's the first thing that has to happen, is a more succinct narrative of exactly what needs to be undertaken. And the second thing is, by us not making it a formal recommendation to council, if, as Chairman Derrickle suggested, and I'm more supportive of, having a letter from Commissioner Perkins, maybe co-signed by, you know, the chairman, that says, here's what I'm interested in, here's what I think needs to get done, here's the best way I think it could be handled, and that gets sent to the city council by a planning commissioner. Then somebody on council can grab that ball, pick it up if they want, can do maybe a little more of their own work on it to formulate exactly what they think the council ought to try to do with it. Then re-engage with staff, so a staff report can be put together on the agenda. I think that's the best way to help council move forward. I think if we kick an ambiguous can up onto their agenda, I think we're doing them a disservice. And so it's with that spirit in mind that I will make a motion to receive and file this report and have two things occur. One is to have that letter by Commissioner Perkins sent to whichever council members or all of them of his choice. And then number two, and I really thank Commissioner Tourget for highlighting the details out of this housing element process. I think that the Planning Commission should be fully engaged with the city and the consultant every step of the way between now and October 2021, which is a long time. I know in terms of staff process time, that's a short time, but in terms of our ability to look at things, study things, and be engaged with every public meeting and every public person that has an interest, we got plenty of time to do that. I think that's going to be something that helps result in actionable results. That's my motion.
Okay, is there a second? I'll second for discussion. So what I'd like to do is I want to meet with Commissioner Perkins and Mr. Curtis and see if we can summarize what has been conveyed this evening by all the commissioners relative to the bigger picture that Commissioner Perkins has brought to us and is elevated in the community, and that is examining Costa Mesa with respect to systemic inequality to the extent that it exists, and do that as I posited in the form of asking the council to form a whether it's an ad hoc human relations committee or a standing human relations committee. But I'd like to sit down with Commissioner Perkins and I don't, maybe somebody in the planning staff who's been taking notes about all this tonight, so we can kind of formulate a letter. And that any commissioner who will send it all around that reviews the letter and wants to sign on to it can sign on to it. Having said that, and we can start dealing with that bigger picture issue. Having said that, I agree with Commissioner Tourget that the housing element is our best opportunity within the budget that we have to have equal housing opportunities across class, race, religion, ethnicity, kind of be at the forefront of policy that informs our next housing element. And I think I agree with Commissioner Zick. The housing element is very important to me for not only that reason, but a host of other reasons. And Mr. Curtis knows I plan to be exceptionally engaged in that process. I am fully, I think, would want the commission to have a working group in addition to the chair, and I'm going to take a point of privilege on that, maybe 2 other commissioners to be a part of the working group for that housing element. And certainly Commissioner Perkins, relative to what he said, or Commissioner Colbert, and certainly Commissioner Tourget, is to have that. So we're constantly asking that question as we go through the housing element process. Are we addressing in this housing element opportunities for equal opportunity, equity for the acquisition, purchase, or rental of housing for income groups, ethnic, racial groups, religious groups? I think if we do it that way, we're tackling a large chunk of what Commissioner Perkins's concerns were. We're doing it in a format that's already budgeted. And I think at the end of the day, we come out with a housing element that is not only responsive to what the state wants from us from a RENA perspective, but what I think our society and our community is demanding from us with respect to how we treat all of our residents. So I guess I would say the motion is receive and file. Let's formalize a letter. I will sign on to it. Commissioner Perkins, obviously, and any other commissioner wants to sign on to it. And then let's maybe we have to agendize this or formalize it in some other meeting, create a commission working group that's going to be a part of the housing element work process. If that's, except Mr. Curtis, does that give you heartburn, or does that work for you, or?
Mr. Chairman, the only thing that you said that gave me a little bit of pause, and I'd maybe weigh in with Mr. Preziosi, is what your intent was with the letter as far as getting it to other commissioners. Was it not to have input, but just to sign if they wish to, or was there to be additional input from other?
I plan to work on the letter with Commissioner Perkins and staff, and then if commissioners can read the draft and they want to sign it, they can sign it.
Okay, as long as it didn't include, I'm thinking of Brown Act issues here. As long as it didn't include other commissioners weighing in on changes or anything like that, I think that's okay.
Mr. Preziosi, you're the legal mind in the room. What's your thought?
Correct. I think no more than 3 commissioners could formulate the letter, and then it would be a question of whether or not the additional commissioners wanted to sign on to it. But if there's going to be a consensus and other commissioners are going to be working on this letter, then that needs to take part in an open and public meeting.
That's not
the,
that's not my intent of adding on to Commissioner Zick's motion, is to really, as the chair of the Planning Commission, I think it's my responsibility to work with Commissioner Perkins, who brought this forward, with staff on the letter. We will bring a draft forward, distribute it to the commissioners, and the instruction will be, you don't get to change it or modify it. You just have to see if you want to sign it or not. So you either agree with it or you don't. That's the intent of it. If commissioners have trouble with that, then you can either vote no on the motion, or I should ask Commissioner Zick, is since I seconded his motion, are those added items in the motion okay with you?
Not the way you've stated it.
Well, that's
and I'll explain myself.
okay.
Having a letter come from one of the planning commissioners, signed by the chair, to me is basically an expression of interest from a citizen, not from the planning commission. And it's that expression to city council members that give them the opportunity to decide if they want to pick up that ball and turn it into something that they would want agendized and worked on. The process of garnering additional signatory support from planning commissioners, I don't want to get bogged.
You don't have to sign the letter.
I don't want to get bogged down in that. But if commissioners wanted to send their own letters to council, they're certainly free to do that. The idea of the second part of what you mentioned, the idea of the formation of a working group to work with the staff on the housing element, I don't fully understand that, because I'm fully expecting to be involved in the public process of the housing element development. I would kind of hope everybody on the commission would be. So I don't fully understand what the idea of a working group is. So that aspect of it, with all due respect, I don't fully understand.
So okay. So your motion is to receive and file.
My motion is to receive and file and have you work with Commissioner Perkins to clarify and package however it is that he would want to express a deliverable interest to council, and to have the city staff ensure a robust inclusion of the Planning Commission in the development of the housing element process.
So why would we include the letter provision if Commissioner Perkins can just write one on his own as a planning commissioner, as you suggested, and just send it to him?
I could have simplified my motion and simply said receive and file, but that isn't my intention. That would certainly be the commission action to receive and file. I went beyond the expression of that formal action to suggest that we're not dropping this thing, but we have an avenue for Commissioner Perkins to get this in front of council in a way that allows them to work on it without there being hours and hours of staff time trying to figure out what in the world this is and how in the world they would approach it.
Okay. Commissioner Perkins, comment.
So I would definitely, Chair Darrell, I like your suggested revisions to this. I feel it's important that a letter on a equity commission come from more than just potentially me. I would love to work with you on that, and I like that idea for that. But I feel personally that it would be important to have that go across the commission, see that there was broad support or not from the commission on that matter. I think the working group also sounds like an excellent idea, especially if it included a direct, explicit focus on ensuring that equity was included in that. So if those items are not going to be included in Commissioner Zick's motion, then I will probably not support that motion.
Okay, Commissioner Zick, so you want to state your motion again real quick?
Receive and file.
Okay. And that's just a straight receive and file?
That makes, you know what I've said. The formal action by the Planning Commission, my recommendation is receive and file.
Okay, so I'll withdraw my second. Is there a second, since I withdraw the second, is there another second for Commissioner Zick's original motion? Okay, so I will make a motion to receive and file to the direct staff to work with the chair and Commissioner Perkins to develop a summary letter requesting a exploration by the council to form a human relations committee and to establish a commission working group to work with the housing element consultant and in developing and working through, or to make sure that the issues of equity and equal opportunity for housing in Costa Mesa are addressed. Is there a second?
I will second.
Second.
Okay, so there's a motion by the chair, and I'm gonna give the second to Commissioner Perkins because this is his ball game.
Mr. Chair.
Not a ball game.
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Curtis. I mean, not Commissioner Curtis, Mr. Curtis.
Thank you for the raise there, sir.
Yes. No.
One other suggestion on the letter would be for you and Commissioner Perkins to get together to formulate the letter, bring it back to the Planning Commission at your next meeting for the commission to adopt the letter and send it to the City Council.
Okay, I'll put that in my motion. Commissioner Perkins, is that all right with you?
Yes.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any final discussion on that?
Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Curtis,
Commissioner Colbert.
just one clarification. During the adoption process of the letter, given that that would be a public forum, if there are any contributions or edits at that time, would that be an allowable option given that it would be public?
Mr. Curtis.
Commissioner, sorry, Chair Dierkel. Are you referring, Commissioner Colbert, to other planning commissioners having comments on it, or are you talking about literally opening up to the public?
No, other planning commissioners having the opportunity to comment on it.
I believe, and correct me if you disagree, Tarquin, but I believe if the item comes before the commission, the commissioners can discuss additional changes if they think they're appropriate, and that could be part of the motion to adopt it.
That is correct.
So Commissioner Colbert, the answer to your question is yes.
Thank you.
Commissioner Russell.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to thank Commissioner Perkins for the work that he's done on this. I mean, it obviously was something that was bubbling up and that needed to be discussed. And I appreciate the opening for a robust conversation. I'm excited about seeing where this goes. I think it's just the beginning of a conversation that's going to go on in the city for quite a while. So thank you for opening that up for us. And thank you to all of the other commissioners for their comments. I mean, we do have several different points of view, and that we have the ability to discuss them in a forum like this is just very useful. So thank you all.
Okay, anyone else? Commissioner Tourget.
Great, thank you. I would just like to say that I support the motion, and I'm also looking forward to the next commission meeting where if we do have comments or suggestions on the letter, those can be incorporated in that public setting. I know so much work went into this and so much thought by Commissioner Perkins and then the rest of the commission and staff and being thoughtful towards what tonight would look like. I wouldn't want this to be a situation where the heart and the work and the importance of this is lost. And so I appreciate the conversation we've been able to have around this. And I'm encouraged that we can move forward in a way that would be actionable.
Excellent. Thank you, Commissioner Tourget. Julie, call the roll vote, please.
Chair Dierkel,
Aye.
Vice Chair Harlan,
Aye.
Commissioner Colbert,
I'm going to abstain.
Commissioner Perkins,
Aye.
Commissioner Russell,
Aye.
Commissioner Tourget,
Aye.
Commissioner Zick.
Aye.
So that motion carried 6-0 with Commissioner Colbert abstaining.
Okay, thank you, commissioners. So Commissioner Perkins and staff, we have some work to do between now and the next meeting. And that brings us to staff reports. And I'm kind of fumbling around with my papers here. So public services report, Mr. Mejia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. I have brief updates on two projects. The first one is the repurposing of the old Donald Dungan Library into the new Norma Herzog Neighborhood Community Center. As you recall, I provided an update some time ago. This project has been under construction for about a year now, and we're in the final stretch. We're about 6 to 8 weeks away from completing this project, and we're expecting substantial completion towards the end of August, early part of September. More information will be coming to you as we get near an opening date to make sure that all of you are invited to attend, whether it is virtual opening or if it is depending on our restrictions for local distancing and COVID-19 restrictions, but more on that to come in the near future. The other project is the bridge shelter. City Council awarded a construction contract at the last City Council meeting for the construction of improvements to convert an existing warehouse into a permanent bridge shelter here in Costa Mesa at 3175 Airway Avenue. Some of the things that are important, I think that some of the major components of this new facility are going to be a full kitchen and room for up to 70 beds that can house clients at that location. The project is scheduled to start in late July, and the construction is going to take approximately 6 months to get us to substantial completion. Again, I will be providing more updates in the near future to let you know how construction is progressing, and then as we get near the completion of the project, about the grand opening for this new facility. And that's all I have for tonight.
Thank you, sir, very much. Mr. Curtis, Development Services.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just wanted to give the commission a little update on a couple of items that staff and City Council have been working on for business assistance, small business assistance within the community. Probably the primary one is at the very end. If anybody stayed till 2 o'clock or so last Tuesday for the council meeting, the City Council approved a small business grant program utilizing about a little under $2 million of the city's CARES Act funding that we got from the County of Orange. We'll be working with the Small Business Development Council to push that program out. We have 3 webinars over the next week or so, 2 in English, 1 in Spanish, to help the business community apply for those grants. Ultimately, businesses, it's on a sliding scale depending on the size of the business, but businesses will be allowed or eligible for grants up to $15,000 per business to be used to offset some of the impacts of the pandemic. I think we've already talked about the steps the City Council took in relaxing some standards to allow outdoor activities, particularly for restaurants and a little bit for churches as well. We're starting to get requests for that. We've had a number of requests that staff has been reviewing. I think that the Public Services Department, sorry for picking on you, Bart, Public Services Department is also looking at the 3 identified pilot projects for where we can look at creating some public spaces within the public right-of-ways. Those 3 areas were along West Randolph Street, along 18th Street near the Eat Chow restaurant, and along East 19th Street near Placentia. As part of that CARES Act funding, a little over $700,000 was allocated to doing those types of improvements, whether those be restriping or other types of improvements in the public right-of-way. So a few exciting things happening. Hopefully, will allow our businesses to succeed as they're opening back up, and to hopefully thrive over time. And that would conclude my presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Curtis. Mr. Preziosi, I think, which commissioner had a legal question? I said we'd have Mr. Preziosi try to answer that at the end of the meeting. I forgot.
It was, I think it actually falls to me, but or Brenda, if she wants to jump in. It had to do with reading emails into the record.
Ah, yes, thank you.
And Brenda was kind enough to respond back to me when I asked her about that. But essentially, we've stopped that practice. We now have normal abilities to get the emails to the commissioners in advance of the meetings. People, because they now have the opportunity to call in and talk at the meetings, either through Zoom or through telephone, we don't feel it's necessary to have to do that anymore. But that is something that, if the commission likes, we could consider adding back into our repertoire, certainly as we look at how we're going to handle these meetings after the COVID closures, and we start to get back to City Hall. If we want to continue with some of these additional enhanced opportunities for the public to participate, that could be something that we look at.
Okay, we can have that conversation later. Mr. Preziosi, do you have a city attorney report?
No further report, Chair Jericho.
Okay, all. Thanks very much. A great conversation about a very important topic. I appreciate all your input, staff. I know, I'm sure the commissioners all know, all of our departments in the city have taken cuts, not insignificant cuts, due to the ongoing economic shutdown due to the pandemic. And so they're working doubly hard to produce the same volume of work with the same quality, with fewer resources for all of next fiscal year. So I just want to extend my appreciation to you, Mr. Curtis, and you, Ms. Lee, and Mr. Mejia and Julie, for all the work you do in difficult circumstances that seem to be getting more difficult. So I just want you to know I appreciate you all, and then I appreciate all of my colleagues on the commission, and we will adjourn to the meeting of July 13th. Thank you very much. Oh, and have a safe and sane 4th of July. We're adjourned. Thank you.